Hello and welcome to another edition of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. My name is Brett, and once again we are here with John Vervaeke. Thanks, John, for being here.
Thanks, Brett. It's always a pleasure to be here.
That's, yeah, thanks. And so I wanted to start off with a question about continuity of practice, and more than that, the willpower to the continuity of
Yeah.
practice. So I think most of us here are convinced about the necessity for oh, and sorry if I could ask people not to have cameras on because we will cut yeah, we'll cut off at 25 people. So I think most people here are convinced as to the desirability of an ecology of practices, and a lot of people start
Mhm.
in ecology of practices, but then what we find is it can be a challenge to continue and to have that
Yes.
willpower to keep it going. Even when we know
Right.
it's good, we get stress, we get other life events coming in, and inevitably people find we find people drifting out or not doing it regularly. So I was wondering if you could just talk generally about that, tips for how to how to keep how we keep us all going. How do we keep
Right.
us motivated to continue, especially when we don't feel like it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, we have to be careful and not to lack compassion in this. When people are under exigent circumstances and they're in scarcity mentality, it's very hard to keep up a more long-term goal. Uh, and so we want to acknowledge that there's going to be times when it's legitimate, right, for people to have to forego a regular practice, precisely because there are more exigent matters that have to be dealt with. So let's put that aside because I've already acknowledged that that's a circumstance that deserves its own appropriate response. So that's a type of circumstance. Uh, so there's some good advice from some of the wisdom traditions that are helpful for that. So in the Buddhist tradition, they talk about the three jewels: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And um, the idea there is if you make a regular habit of doing something that isn't that demanding, which is trying to remember at the end of every day moments in which you experienced your Buddha nature. And for those of us who aren't Buddhists, what that means is moments where you thought you acted more wisely, that you were able to cut through some self deception, that you acted more virtuously, that you're closer to the kind of cognitive agent that you aspire to be. And the point about this is if you are more regularly and reliably identifying with your future self, this actually helps in a positive manner. This actually helps self regulation. This has been shown experimentally. So if you ask people to solve money, if you ask people to save money, you can present, and this experiment was done with academics. You ask them to save money, you present them all the evidence, like for retirement, all the evidence, and they all acknowledged, yes, yes, oh, yes, yes. And then, of course, after a couple of weeks, they stop saving money because, oh, well, I wanted to buy this, I wanted to buy that. So what's happening is, well, it turns out that people don't want to actually identify with their future self, their old future self, because their old future self is ugly and sick and closer to death. And so, what did they do in the experiment? Well, they got people to think of their relationship to their future self as one of caring for a beloved relative. That old man or that old woman is a beloved relative that you have to take care of. And when they did that and they had people reformulate their attitude, their pattern of identification, people started saving money much more regularly and reliably. It wasn't a matter of rational persuasion or even willpower as some sort of metabolic expenditure. It was a matter of reconfiguring how people identify with their future self so they find that identification more positive, more valuable to them. So that's what it is to, I think, cultivate the Buddha. The Dharma is in order to keep at something, you have to keep learning about it. Um, so learning is the sort of opposite of being in a depressive cycle. And so if you are learning new things about your practice, perhaps learning more about how to practice it, how to improve practicing it, that's one direction, but also deepening the philosophical foundations of your practice. Um, and of course, that's why people went to church. They went to church because that was a place where they learned new ways and they were deepening the practice. And then that leads me to the last thing, which is the Sangha. If you want to do a practice, you have to make a meta commitment to regularly meet with other human beings because commitments to other human beings are some of the most powerful. Stoicism helps all of that by reminding us that the only way we replace one habit is with another habit, and that it's actually quite easy to pick up habits. Think about how you find yourself doing things habitually that you didn't have to exert any effort in, any effort for. So, if you develop some of these easy habits to acquire that are meta habits, like uh, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, they can help motivate you towards the more specific habits of your specific practices. And is this a surefire method? No, because there is no such thing as a surefire method. But are these the methods that both the traditions and the science converge on as what helps people keep going? Yeah, they are. They're the methods that help people keep going. Is there still going to be attrition in any community? Yeah, there's still going to be attrition. No matter uh, how sort of wonderful the community is, there's still going to be attrition. Some of it's because people do have legitimate reasons, and others, and of course, Another reason is these methods that I've just relayed. They aren't perfect. They're not algorithmic because they can't be because they have to do with some very deep aspects of our cognitive processing that can't be handled just by simple algorithms or methods or rules. Um, so I found that as you start to do these sort of meta habits, they start to get me doing other things more regularly. And then what happens is I start to scaffold habits onto habits. Um, and as I get one layer of habits sort of established, I can add other habits to that already existing set of habits and build it up. Um, so I've tried to give you sort of a three-line convergence onto this. Sort of what do the traditions say? What does some of the best science say? And what have I found personally helpful in my own attempts to cultivate a sustaining practice? And that's that's sort of the best answer I can give to the question, Brett.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So let's say you wake up in the morning and it's your normal time to meditate, and boy, you just don't feel like it that day. What does your
Yeah.
self talk look like to get you back into saying, okay, I'm going to do it?
Well, typically I don't initially start the self talk. Typically, what I do if when I'm getting that kind of resistance is well, maybe there's one moment of self talk, which is I'm already meditating. Well, what do you mean you're already meditating? Well, I'm already meditating because I'm being mindful of the resistance. And
Mm.
what I'll do is start applying the five factors. So I'm already in it. I don't have to start it. The resistance itself is something in which I'm already doing, right? The practice. I'm already meditating. I'm applying the five factors of inquiring mindfulness, or perhaps directing metta towards that part of myself that doesn't want to do the practice, etc.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's very helpful. Thanks so much. So
You're
last
welcome.
Q&A, we left off with the teaser from Jules, and he's ready to pick up on it this month. So
Okay.
Jules, let's hear it.
Thanks, Brett. Hi, John, and hi, everybody.
Hi,
John,
hi, hi,
thanks for.
Jules.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much, John, for your time. I think it's late where you are in Toronto.
It's fairly late. It's about 6:45, and we've just put the clocks back, so it's been dark since 5 o'clock here. So my brain is telling me it's very, very late. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I was kind of preparing for that, so it's worse than I thought. Sorry.
That's okay. I'll still try and give you my best.
Yeah, well, so will I, and I think that's apropos. So if you'll indulge me,
Sure.
please, and everybody else, this is a really good faith question relating to something, I suppose, that goes all the way through your stack, through
Hmm.
your model,
Yeah.
and something that I'm hoping everybody on the call, who we're a community, cares about, and that's the religion that's not a religion.
You very much. Yes.
Um, yeah. So as I say, I'm just going to beg for a little bit of indulgence because I am going to apply some of your language. I try to avoid being technical, but I think it's necessary because it appears like your time is getting more and more uh, demanded on, for want of a better word.
That's
So I'll
very
just dive.
accurate, Jules. That's very accurate and kind of you to mention that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you too. So let me get into it. One of the analogies, John, that you use that I really like is you've pulled from Homer's Odysseus the navigating between Scylla and
Charybdis. Yeah.
Charybdis.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just a really good thing. I had no idea about it until you started bringing it up. But I really like how it informs us that we need to be watching on both sides of an issue. And I think, in particular, your concept of the religion that is not a religion not only requires that skill, but it seems to me, because of our time in history, it requires that skill to the highest degree.
I think that's totally right. Yep. I
Thank you.
agree.
Now, I did, as Brett said before, leave off last week by kind of teasing on Auguste Comte, and I'm going to come to
Yep.
that in a moment. But I want you to know I'm coming from the best faith possible.
I believe you. Let's take that
Yeah,
for granted. Let's take that
yeah.
for granted.
Okay. So my tradition is Christian.
Yes.
I was interested to hear you talking with Jonathan Pajot through Rebel Wisdom this
Right.
weekend,
Right. Right.
and I would probably summarize his view as, hey, why are we reinventing the wheel? There's plenty of religions out there. Just dip in, and she'll be right. I am a little bit more optimistic. I think about the potential for religion that's not a religion. My theory at the moment is that you're doing a little bit like William of Ockham back in the day. That religion that's not a religion is going to be a useful tool to sort of cut away things which aren't right. And even in the Christian tradition, I think there's room to allow for that because, Jesus talking about pruning the vines.
Sure. Sure.
Now, what I've noted is that the potential that goes with religion that's not a religion also comes with peril. And that's what
Yes.
I really wanted to
Yep.
surface in the community. And I'm going to talk about our nearest history. So you've outlined clearly when we try to do religion by using a political ideology.
That's been a disaster. Yeah.
I beg your pardon?
I said it's been a disaster. Yeah.
It's been a disaster. Yeah. And in the spirit of Dialogos, I'll just disclose quickly my mum grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, 1947,
Right.
and her auntie and her auntie's parents were killed by the Nazis.
Yeah.
So she's been impacted by that. It's not something I take lightly. That's why I'm bringing this up.
Yeah. I agree. I agree.
Solzhenitsyn said if he was going to summarize what went wrong with that whole project, and excuse me, this is a real shortcut, but he just basically said we forgot about God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This leads me to the other side, John, which is comparing your idea of religion that's not a religion with Auguste Comte's positivism,
Yes. Yep.
which seems to be a fruitful thing to talk about. And again, in a positive, excuse me, in a helpful way,
Mm-hmm.
because you're a bit like Comte, I would say, and
I hope
that's not
so.
Yeah, that's right.
I have lots of criticisms. I have lots of criticisms of Compton positivism, but go ahead. But go ahead.
Yeah, great. I can't wait to hear them. What I mean to say is that back 100 years ago, or whenever it was, not that far ago, here's a guy who's come up with an achievement within science,
Mm,
positing the virtues of science. That is exciting, and I sort of have this joke with myself. It's the new hotness, right?
yeah, yeah.
and now you're the new hotness, and religion
Oh,
that's not a religion is the new hotness, right? And that's dangerous in itself. But it was interesting what happened, isn't it? I don't want to be triumphalist about this. In other words, obviously that project kind of just petered out.
you petered out because it was dependent on his personal charisma, right? That I mean, as long as he was around, the sort of churches that he was setting up were surviving, but they didn't survive him. Yeah, very much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I'm just going to leave off on that with a few more things, just real quick. I'm glad that you don't want this to be a personality cult. None of
Yeah,
us do want that.
yeah,
However,
yeah, very much.
those of us who are here also feel like we appreciate your encouragement. We very much appreciate your teaching. But in a sense, we need to disembody all of that from you, but still feel a sense of participation.
Hmm.
But also on the other side of it, it can't be just this clever thing where it's like people are outdoing themselves by using your jargon on top of jargon as a way of kind of signaling, I know more than you. So
Yeah.
that's
So,
the Scylla and Charybdis. Please go over to you. Thank you.
oh no, no, no. I mean, I think that was all wonderful. First of all, yeah, don't want the cult of personality. That's why I did that whole video with Jordan Hall. How the next Buddha is the Sangha, right? I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And um, I I try to talk to people in good faith who come from the established religions, precisely because, um, well, I don't know about God because Buddhism doesn't have a God, and I don't think Taoism does. But I don't want to forget about the sacred, and that's I think a deep and important difference between Comte's positivism and what I'm talking about, and that's why I keep working on it, and I keep trying to figure out ways in which people can reliably come into right relationship with sacredness. So I think that's an important difference. So two important differences with Comte is I don't want this to be dependent on me or my personality or whatever it is. And secondly, and I think if you'll allow me to bend Solzhenitsyn a little, and I think you should because I think Buddhism and Taoism are very successful religions as well. I don't want to forget about the sacred, and I make it central and I enter into discussion with people of various religions in order precisely because I believe I can learn from them. And as I said to Jonathan, I don't think this is any kind of competitive exclusiveness. I think a lot of what I'm trying to do. Well, I know because people tell me it is. They can take it up into their particular religion and find it valuable and useful, and not in just a trivial cosmetic fashion, but often in a very they tell me in a very deep and transformative fashion. And I've had Christians and Muslim and even Buddhists say, the stuff you've done has taken me to a depth that I never got or I didn't get for years or things like that. And so for me, that's another difference with Comte, right? I'm really trying to enter into a good faith dialogue that's not like it. You know what? If I fail in this way, that I create, ecologies of practices that get taken back up into all the existing religions and it disappears that way, and all those existing religions are really strengthened and revived so that they can comprehensively respond to the meaning crisis, then great,
Mm.
great, like genuinely great. That would I yes,
Yes.
that would be great, right? So that's another way. I'm not. I don't have Comte's teleological model that the theological has to be inevitably and completely replaced by the scientific or anything like that. So I, I'm not claiming it, I'm not claiming any kind of completion or anything. But what I'm trying to say, Jules, is I take seriously what you're talking about, and I'm trying to point to you regular and reliable practices that I'm doing to try and address these concerns, and I'm trying to exemplify it, not just speak about it, but actually exemplify it by how I'm doing all of these things. Uh, so my
Oh, you
concern.
are.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, look, I mean, I can even speak first person. Even in just getting ready for this question, I've learned so much because you're acting as a spur. And I
Right.
mean, things that I normally want to avoid, like theology and
Yeah.
dogma, I have to think
Yeah.
about.
Right. Right.
Um, but I think there's a if you could talk to this in a communal way, if I can just sort of beg for that, and I don't want to take up everyone's time, but those of us who are interested in the religion that's not a religion,
Mm-hmm.
um, and what it could mean. Like, to be frank, I kind of think what you're talking about is Neoplatonism, but I don't want to presume. But having said that, going back to the Holocaust or
Mm-hmm.
communism, one of the things my mum said was it was really clear to her as a child how people living under those systems, communism particularly, would just sell each other out really
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's not about Marx or Stalin, or everyone talks about, well, it wasn't done the right way. There's a really good idea, but it wasn't done the right way. It
Yeah.
just seems to me that the capacity for human nature to look at a really attractive system and then take that system as, to put it in your language, merely propositional,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is incredibly dangerous.
Right. Uh, but
How can that
that,
not happen to us?
well, I mean, I don't think the relevant question there is being religious or not, because that problem, of course, doesn't happen just within secular ideologies. That has happened also in the history of religions too. And
Yes. Yeah.
that's at the core of James Carse, who we unfortunately not lost just a few weeks ago. But his book, The
Mm.
Religious Case Against Belief, is precisely about how that I don't know what to call it, that dangerous drift to pure
Mm.
propositionalism has been found also within the history of religion. So again, I don't think that's an issue that is going to be addressed by being religious as opposed to being non-religious. So I've tried to address that by the issue of trying to wake people up to and get them not just committed in belief, but committed in practice to the idea and the realization, because it's not just an idea, the realization that most of meaning making is not being carried at the propositional level. It's being carried at the other P's, right? And
Mm.
so that's right. So because I think the issue isn't religious versus non-religious. I think it's precisely the issue of propositional versus perspectival and participatory.
Yes.
And so that's how I've tried to address that issue. It's like, yes, uh, we will keep trying to reduce our our what should I call it, the confrontation with sacredness to the assertion of beliefs. But we have to constantly reawaken people to how mistaken that drift is, and that is something that I've tried to afford as much as possible.
Yeah, and I love it. I won't take up more time, but thank you very much for addressing it, John, and keep up the great work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Um, I really appreciated that discussion a lot. Thank you very
So
much.
did I, and I appreciate your encouragement. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both. Karima, you have a question.
Hey, Karima.
Hi there. It's so good to be here with everyone.
It's good to hear you.
Yes. So Jung called the self, with a capital S, the
Yeah.
totality of the archetypes.
Yeah.
And I understand this as the God ideals in the world mind, individuating in the personal psyche. But
Yeah.
that, and you can clear me up on that. But while I've noticed several archetypes showing up in my life over the years, how does one become more aware of maladapted complexes to bring them forth from the personal and collective unconscious? McLennan speaks of using Damians and the
Yeah.
imaginal,
Yeah.
which is just like in the Sufi mysticism, we have the Barzakh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so how do we work or play with these complexes, and is connecting with guides for grace maybe one of our most helpful tactics?
That's a really good and complex question. First of all, the connection to Sufism, and this is why I've taken pains to try and get people to pay more attention to Corban, who was a contemporary of Jung, and they deeply influenced each other. And whereas Corban tended to give a lot of text to Jung, Jung doesn't do the same justice, I think, to Corban. And Corban, of course, made the important distinction between the imaginal and the imaginary, and learning how to, and this is something I think that you find in a convergent fashion being advocated for by Goethe or by Blake. Learning how to retrain the imagination so it's not just imaginary but also imaginal. I think is very important. Uh, Now that being said, uh, and Corban, I think, makes this clearer than Jung, although Jung brings it up as well. And this is the point, I think, of your question. The fact that we get things like complexes, which I think are very, I think they're Jungian analogs for what I call parasitic processing, the way in which our cognitive biases take on a life of their own and self-organize into systems within our psyche and suck life from us. And that's becoming sort of a more central idea within mainstream cognitive science and clinical psychology. We have to be careful about engaging the imaginal, precisely because there is a very significant chance that it is going to be beset by parasitic processing, by by complexes. So the very attempt to use the imaginal in order to try and address complexes is very liable to get us swallowed up more deeply in self-deceptive processes, which is one of the reasons why I'm sort of very critical of a purely romantic approach to these kinds of issues, because there's a lack of a concern for the prevalence and the proclivity towards self-deception. Jung was, of course, very well aware of that. He brought up, the Gnostic myth of the individual who sees the glint below them and dives inappropriately into the depths of towards death because they have mistaken the reflection from above for gold to be found beneath. And so we have to be really, really careful about this. Yeah, McClellan talks about daemons, and Jung had he had his own with Philemon. Many people don't find those visualization practices uh, too helpful because there is such significant variation in the degree in which people can have absorption into their own visualization. In fact, it's estimated that 5 to 10% of the population doesn't have mental imagery in that sense. So we have to be really careful here about what we're recommending, that we don't unthinkingly exclude a lot of people. So I tend to think that if you're going to pursue these imaginal practices, you should have spent a lot of time first addressing how you can fall prey to self-deception, and that's where the Stoic practices are so important, and that's why, of course, McClellan says you have to, have mastered the Stoic practices before you go into the Neoplatonic practices. I think people, and I'm not accusing you of this, Karima. But I think people who leap directly into the Neoplatonic practices they're like the person mistaking the glint and diving down instead of climbing up. I think that's very dangerous and misplaced thing to do. I think you need to spend a lot of time uh, acquiring virtues, the civic virtues. Even the Neoplatonists said this, that before you pursue the contemplative virtues, you have to have really pursued the civic virtues to overcome self-deception. And you have to really have internalized sages like Socrates or perhaps Jesus or perhaps Rumi, so that you have their voice as a kind of guidance, um, and you have to have the proper relationship between your own emerging inner teacher and those internalized teachers, like the way that we've internalized other human beings into our metacognition, and then that has to be taken place within a community. So I think once you are, and I know you are because you've let me know. I think once you've done a lot of work on active open-mindedness and other things for addressing self-deception, once you've significantly, like systemically and reliably internalized some sages, and once you belong to a community of practices, then I would recommend taking up uh, those imaginal practices that the sort of theurgic practices within Neoplatonism, because I think they are the primary way. If we have serious imaginal play, uh, deeply scaffolded and constrained by community and by a commitment to rationality. And by that, I mean the systemic and systematic overcoming in a reliable fashion of self deception. Then that serious play has a very good chance of being efficacious. But I do, like I say, you have to have versions of that that can be practiced in externally, like they can be acted out in drama, for example, or, and Jung knew this, through works of art or through poetic expression, because we can't rely on internal mental imagery because too many people, there's too much variation in that, and there would be just a lot of people that would just automatically be excluded because they don't have such mental imagery.
Well, that all makes very good sense. And the only other thing I was wondering is in recognizing archetypes, I guess it's more difficult to recognize complexes, and that
Yeah,
word, I didn't quite get the meaning. But, everything is, in the personal or collective unconscious. It's like the still small voice. That which we need to hear the most of is the quietest. But anyways, so how do we bring some of that to the foreground? I did go through uh,
yeah,
the practice on the shadow, and
yeah.
I'm familiar with that. But there's some other a lot of complexes we have, I guess, that are like floating around in there.
Well, well, I mean, so in addition to learning to recognize, I think like a complex is basically, like I said, a sort of static Jungian version of the more dynamical parasitic processing idea that our biases very that they are individually adaptive, and they make use of the fact that our cognition is adaptive by being dynamically self-organizing, and they self-organize into complex dynamical systems that run of their own accord. And so I do think learning how to deal with self-deception and building a counteractive, like I argue for in the series, a dynamical system like the eight-spoked wheel of Buddhism, I think is part of how you do that. But the particular issue about sensitizing yourself to the still small voice, that's where I think the practice of dialogos is so important. So the practice of dialectic, and insofar as it realizes dialogos, is precisely the practice of learning to listen to um, a much more subtle and often backgrounded intelligibility that dialectic and dialogos are, well, dialectic is a practice, dialogos is the process. The dialectic is specifically designed to try and enhance and try and afford. And so, and this is the core sort of Platonic idea. As I get better at realizing intelligibility with others and being more sensitive to subtleties that they can make me aware of, I get better at realizing intelligibility within me and becoming more sensitive to the kind of subtleties that I otherwise might miss. And that's a key idea going all the way back to Socrates. That if you want to get much better at a nuanced self-examination, you have to get into a way of dialoguing with people that is specifically oriented towards the goal of getting better at picking up on much more nuanced and subtle presentations and developments of intelligibility. And so that particular, and that's why I think dialectic was the capstone practice within Neoplatonism. And I think because it specifically sensitizes us in such a powerful way.
Because your own intuition is in that chorus, that silent chorus.
Well, your intuition is in it, but you're also internalizing other people's intuition sort of into your own intuition and vice versa, which is nuancing it, complexifying it, not in the sense of a complex, but developing it, right? Making it much more, much more flexible and sensitive, therefore, to subtleties and to much more dynamical patterns in which things can organize and emerge.
Yes, I see that. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karima. That brings up something that Jules mentioned that I didn't get a chance to address. I don't know if he accused me. I don't think he had any ill intent. I sensed good faith and affection from him, but I don't know what verb to use. One's escaping me. Maybe he labeled me, but that sounds pejorative too, as a Neoplatonist. There's a sense in which I think that's correct. I'm sort of a Taoist, Buddhist, naturalistic Neoplatonist. Yes. And the fact that Neoplatonism has so readily been taken into Islam and Sufism, into Christianity, and Neoplatonism is deep and profound through Christianity, through paganism, in at least some forms of Gnosticism, speaks to, I think, its power and capacity for awakening spirituality for people in varying religious traditions, which is one of the reasons why I find it so deeply attractive.
Oh, never an accusation, sir. Never an accusation.
Well, yeah, I thought so, Jules. I just wanted to. But no verb was coming to mind, or no noun. So there you go.
Description.
I'll join the queue and maybe address that at the end if there's time. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a true description, perhaps. Maybe that's a much more apropos way of describing it. No pun intended.
Yeah, and not of you, of the idea of religion that's not a religion. Just
right.
For what it's
yeah.
Yeah.
And I believe
a lot of filia. Sorry, Brett.
Yeah, no, I was just going to bring. I think Manuel had a follow up on this topic, so I thought I'd bring him in now to ask that.
Which is this topic, the Neoplatonism, or the thing that Karima was asking about?
That Karima was asking about.
Right. Okay.
So you were talking about scaffolds being provided by the community. So I was wondering if you could be some more exploratory about how we could implement those scaffolds, or like what would be examples of those scaffolds.
Oh well, I mean, it's coming out in a book that we've sent to the publisher, where I've tried to outline a sort of a pedagogical program, and most religious communities have a pedagogical program in which you learn this set of skills first, and then that affords the next set of skills, and so on and so forth. And so I think what I'm talking. I mean, so you see this, for example, standard, mainstream Catholicism, or Eastern Orthodoxy. You become a catechumen, and you go through catechism, and basically we saw something analogous in the Wisdom of Hypatia, where you start with sort of Epicureanism, and then that makes possible Stoicism, and then that makes the Stoic practices make possible Neoplatonic practices. And that's what I mean by scaffolding. It's a pedagogical program in which you try and set up sets of practices and that meet people where they are, and then build up a set of skills and virtue, and then you give them transitional practices that then move them to the next grade or level or stage. You see the same thing in the martial arts. You have the belt system. You don't start. You don't do any of the katas for a black belt when you start. You do the katas for a white belt because that trains and shapes your muscles and your perceptions and your coordination, and so that you can then do the yellow belt, which then you do new katas and you work your way through in that fashion. So that's what I mean by scaffolding. So communities, and of course there's variation in this, but you see in all of these wisdom traditions and religious traditions that you have the scaffolding. Now there's the danger, and this is the danger that Jules pointed out, that the catechism process, which is supposed to be a pedagogical program, can often degenerate just into an indoctrination process. That's why I tried to use like examples from the martial arts. I mean, there's still some indoctrination going on there, but largely it's about getting clear about how various constellations of skill sets afford and make possible, because they actually shape you. They shape your bodies. They shape your body and your mind, so that you can then acquire new skills with that new body and mind that then shape you, so that you can acquire new skills for your body and mind, etc. That's what I'm talking about, Manuel.
Yeah, that's an awesome explanation. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Great. Ben Gow, you have a question for John.
Yeah, thanks, Brett and John. Hello.
Hi, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. I want to first of all for all the teachings. I started watching you when COVID struck, and you started the meditation series, and it has been immensely helpful to me. So thank you very much for that.
I'm glad to hear that. It's helpful to me to know that what I do is helpful to others. What keeps me going. Sometimes the veneers and other things make it very hard, and so
Yeah, well,
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, knowing that you're dealing with that as well as many other things that you're focused on, it makes them even more grateful for the work you're doing. Uh, the, my question sort of relates to the series. It more specifically relating to sort of strong emotions and the role of strong emotions.
Mhm.
I was listening to another podcast, and they were talking about the evolutionary adaptability of rage, which I guess helps to overcome the limits of rationality. The most basic of which is sort of just being slow, but I think perhaps a bigger contribution would be the sort of overcoming the limits of rationality when it comes to things like prisoner's dilemma and the irrationality of sacrificing oneself for the public good and things like that.
Mm.
And I think the same can be said for a lot of other emotions, for providing motivation to do things that are perhaps good, but perhaps are irrational when it comes to sort of a social context. So I wanted to ask you, what is the role of strong emotions in wisdom practices? A part of it is that just following the meditation and the cultivating wisdom series. My sense is that mostly we're trying to detach ourselves from instincts and instinctive reactions and emotions. The emotions I'm seeing, maybe awe is one of the emotions that's brought up, even though I'm not clear about the exact role of awe in this. And then the other emotions seems to be sort of best avoided or sort of logically interpreted. So I want to see if there is a role for these strong emotions in providing motivation, perhaps, or how do you incorporate them, I guess.
Okay, so there's a lot there. First of all, if I've tried to convey that wisdom is a process of sort of detaching from emotion, I've misled you, and I that's a mistake on my part. I and I would challenge the idea that because I mean I did graduate school with Rania D'Souza, who wrote the book on this, and it's the rationality of emotions in the 80s in philosophy. And of course, Damasio in Descartes' Error argues that we shouldn't think of emotion and rationality as oppositional. That rationality is needs emotion, and emotion it needs rational. I mean, so Damasio's point is, if you get people who have sort of a disconnect between their frontal lobes and the more emotional centers of the brain, they could sort of pass a standard IQ test because the frontal lobe areas is still sort of working, but you can sort of cause them to collapse. And maybe this is something like the prisoner's dilemma, but just by doing the following, asking them if they want to take the test and if they want to write the test in red or blue ink, because then they try to calculate all the possibilities. See, so what emotions do is they perform the necessary function of shaping our salience landscape to avoid combinatorial explosion. They're a primary way in which we are capable of being a cognitive agent. And of course, for a very long time, it was thought that rationality and emotion were interpenetrating with each other. That's definitely through the Christian tradition. There's lots of emotions that are supposed to be at work within Christianity. Spinoza, of course, also saw this. He said, right, you can only deal with one emotion with another emotion. It was only, I think, with Romanticism and sort of Descartes and Romanticism that we get the proposal that they should be separated as seen as oppositional. Most of 4E cognitive science has tended to significantly reduce that. And so if you take a look, for example, at the ancients, let me give you one clear example. Aristotle famously said, the issue is not about being angry or not being angry. The issue is being angry at the right time for the right reason to the right degree, which is the emotion is often what is needed. What you have to do is avoid the emotion being self-deceptive, which is the emotion. So if I'm angry at the wrong time for the right reason, for the wrong reason, or to the wrong degree, then of course I'm going to lose the adaptivity precisely because the emotion is making the wrong thing salient to me, and that's a form of self-deception. So I don't see the point as I'm trying to get rid of emotion at all. And I mean, that's certainly not in Stoicism. And the Stoics made a deep distinction between emotion and what they call passion. Now, we have a positive meaning of the word passion. We think it just means intense emotion. And that's a mistake on our part because the original meaning of passion comes from pathe, pathetic, right? So it means when the emotion and they compared it like this: emotion is walking down a hill. The force of gravity is drawing you, it's leading you on, but you can stop when needed. You can change direction when needed. Passion is when you're running down a hill and you can't stop and you can't change direction because you have set yourself into a process like parasitic processing that has taken on such a life of itself that you have lost the ability to redirect your behavior. And so I think strong emotions are central to wisdom. And the point, again, is making them strong in a way that enhances our ability to zero in on the relevant information and adjust our actions accordingly. Now, about rage, I'm concerned by the fact that outrage is becoming more and more presented socially as a virtue. I think this is a very dangerous idea. Um, um, we used to have this adjective outrageous, meaning it should be condemned because it has taken something uh, too far. It has not been at the right time, to the right degree, for the right reasons. And I think we shouldn't give up on the fact that our emotions can become passions and we can become overwhelmed by our passions. And so the point I would say is um, rationality keeps emotions from becoming passions, and emotions prevent our attempts to be rational from being overwhelmed by combinatorial explosion. So I think you what you should be thinking about, if you'll allow me, because you asked for my advice, is how these practices help you to weave together overcoming self deception with the experience of emotion so that your emotions unfold wisely as opposed to passionately. That's what I would say.
Okay. Um, Thank you. I mean, um, would it be right to say that the idea is to have anger or rage, but have a control over how much you get into it, or how much you uh, when you want to stop?
Well, it would be, yeah, control's the right word, but it's having developed the habits and the virtues so that you're not blinded by the emotion. If you're blinded by rage, how that's ultimately can't be adaptive, right? If and this is what Aristotle meant, if my anger blinds me to the situation, I'm going to, well, that's self-deceptive, it's potentially self-destructive, it's very liable to be other destructive. But if my anger becomes a lens that focuses me, it doesn't blind me, but focuses me appropriately on what needs to be done, then that's wise anger. That's virtuous anger.
Okay. Thank you. I'll think about that more. And I think most likely this distinction between emotion and how stoicism or meditation is supposed to sort of uh, uh, stop me from feeling overwhelming emotion is sort of my own sort of coloring of what you're teaching. And I think it does make sense to me what you say about not letting your emotions uh, letting my emotions blind me.
Right.
Um, so okay,
But
thank you.
but on the other hand, don't forget that your emotions also enable you to see. I'm saying both of those.
Hmm. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Mark, you have a question.
Hey, Mark.
Hey, John. I hope you're holding up okay with your Meniere's. I know that was bothering you recently.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty bad. I mean, I'm glad that my camera's off because I'm sort of sitting in a fashion that's reducing, the tendency to vertigo, which probably wouldn't be too pleasant for people who were watching me visually. But I can keep going. So I look forward to your question.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I don't even want to ask a question after Jules. Man, I could go on about that forever. He really opened up my mind, as he often does when he has the time to grace us with his
I agree with you.
presence.
I thought that was just wonderful. I was deeply appreciative. I mean, I've been appreciative of everybody, but you're mentioning Jules again. I'm deeply appreciative of that dialogue. Um, yeah,
Thanks,
I agree.
guys.
I agree
Yeah,
with you.
right back at
Yeah.
you. Guys.
So I'll go with my easy question that I've wanted to ask for a while, but haven't really gotten around to. So, you talk a lot about having mode and being mode, and that's great, and it's super powerful, and we use it all the time. We just scream at each other that we're having and being all the time, usually because we're just screw with each other and we like to yell at each other. Um, but I was wondering how the having mode and the being mode stuff, because I don't get this sense either from the meditation, and I didn't get it when I was watching the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, and maybe my memory is failing me. That's always possible. It's 50 hours of awesomeness. Um, how that like does that cohere in some way or map some way to the ways of knowing, or is there some other cogsci model that the having mode and being mode relates, and then
Oh
specifically, of
yeah, it
course,
does.
to
Yeah.
the practices in particular, right? Because that's my biggest concern, obviously, right? I work primarily on the practices with Manuel and a bunch of other people on here, so that's what I'm looking for.
That's a fantastic question, Mark. That's a great question. Um, and so again, sorry, I don't mean to be promissory, but the book is coming out. It's at the publishers now, and because I try and do I there's convergence here. I hope you find it helpful, convergence, because I also thought of that as a lack that I needed it to be addressed. And so the cog side that I tried to map it onto wasn't the four ways of knowing, because I think all four ways of knowing can be done within the having mode or the being mode. And you can even have different sort of, curiosity versus wonder, etc. So instead, what they get mapped onto is some work that's done by Michael Apter. This is called Reversal Theory. There's a book called Reversal Theory, and he has a more recent book called Zigzag, where he goes over a lot of his work. Now, there's a lot there, Mark, and the text will have a lot more in it. So I'm just going to give you a gist of the idea. And he calls these meta-motivational frames or modes. And this also overlaps, as you'll see, with Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. And the idea is we have a core process, which is arousal. Arousal in and of itself, which is metabolic arousal. I don't mean just sexual arousal. Metabolic arousal is just inherently neutral. And then we interpret it in one of two ways, depending on the framing we're in. So when we're in the telic mode, that means we are doing some activity, and the point of the activity is for the goal that's going to be achieved. And therefore, when we're in the telic mode, the higher the level of arousal, it means we're putting in more effort, which means we have not achieved the valued goal. And so if more and more effort goes in, we get increasingly frustrated, and then eventually angry. But once we achieve the goal, the effort drops. And when the effort drops within the telic mode, that's an indication that we've either given up, in which we might go into sadness, or we've achieved our goal, in which we experience that low level of arousal as very pleasant relaxation. But when we're in the paratelic mode, we are doing activities for their own sake. We set up goals, but the goals are not what's valuable. So we're playing a piece of music, and we're trying to we're moving towards the end, or we're playing a game of tennis, and we have all these structures set up about winning and losing. But the point is actually to enjoy the playing of the music or enjoy the playing of the tennis. Now, when you're in the paratelic mode, arousal is interpreted exactly the opposite. This is why it's called reversal theory. Arousal is now interpreted as, right, the more arousal I am, the more that indicates I'm involved with the intrinsically, inherently interesting or valuable experience. And so instead of arousal being interpreted as frustration, increased arousal is interpreted as excitement. And of course, sexual arousal typically fits that model. And typically, sexual arousal is done within, sex is performed within the paratelic mode. And so, if you think about it, and this is, and Apter uses the term, the telic mode, he says it's basically what we try to capture when we're talking about work. And then the paratelic mode is what we try to capture with the word play. But it's a more sophisticated model, obviously, and I'm doing it injustice here because I'm simplifying it. So because I don't have that much time, and then I think you can make a very clear mapping of the having mode onto the telic mode, and the being mode onto the paratelic mode, and these have to do with very fundamental processes by which people are interpreting, and this is embodied cognition, the arousal that they're experiencing in their minds and body, and that goes very deep to their level of identification, and that's why it's an existential mode. So that's how I would, yeah. So that's okay. That's all coming out in the in one of the chapters in the book. Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I definitely need that book. Okay, so the connection I hadn't made before that you beautifully made here, I think, was the telic to the paratelic, which you went over in that wonderful whiteboard presentation
Sure.
Recently. That was great. So, just real quick then, what are the practices then? I mean, are the practices falling into two buckets? Practices that are telic and paratelic? Because I often talk about this idea of meditation has no first order effects. You've heard that before. I think you kind of liked it, as I recall. And then so what we're after are these second order effects, and because there's no first order effects, or at least they're hard to measure, or whatever, they're inconsistent, or however you want to frame it. We have a problem cohering to the meditation, but then we have to look for the second order effects, and those take time. And this goes back to Brett's original question, like how do we find the energy, the motivation to stay in, or are there some practices that are telic? Is there a bridge between telic and paratelic in your practices? That's more the key I'm going for as a follow-up, if you could.
Yeah, no, I didn't talk about this in the chapter, and this isn't a complete answer to your question, because as you can see, this is stuff I'm sort of currently trying to put together. But I think there's a higher order practice where people actually, and this goes to work coming from Polanyi, in which people can actually cycle between the telic and the paratelic. And you see this happening like in circling. People will go in and they're sort of in the telic mode, and they're working very hard to try to get something to happen. And then they flip over into paratelic, and then the excitement, the high arousal goes from being this hard work to being this flowing excitement. But then, the flow might start to break down, and they'll drop out of the paratelic and they'll drop back into the telic mode, because they'll work, they'll put in some effort. And so they're constantly toggling between sort of effortful work, and then which often at times can be very exhausting and sometimes even frustrating. And they're toggling between that and paratelic, in which they're getting into the flow state. By the way, Csikszentmihalyi describes the flow state as an autotelic state, which is exactly parallel to Apter's paratelic mode. And they were writing at virtually the same time. I don't think they knew each other initially. So I think there's a sense in which people, when they're doing this kind of thing, and again, here's the martial art analogy. Like, there's aspects of training that you pursue telic, because you want to go from the white belt to the yellow belt, and that's telic. It's telic all the way through. And and if you get that way, then you'll get lost into modal confusion, because you get the people who just want to have the belts, and then they just destroy the competition, and they're horrible. But because what you should be doing is you should be toggling between the telic pursuit of the next belt and the paratelic playing with what's happening, and how it's getting you into remembering, what kind of mind and body you have, reinterpreting your arousal, changing your character, all those paratelic criteria that we've been talking about. And this has been my own experience too. So I have taken up different Tai Chi forms. And when you initially do it, it's such a telic thing to do. You have to take up the new form, very much like you said. For a very long time, there's no objectively measurable first order results. So you just keep working through, and you just try to learn this form, and it's very telic. But what happens, and that's why I do it, is there gets to be a place, and this is like, again, jazz versus practicing your scales, where I can flip into the paratelic mode. And then what that does is I'm now in the being mode. And what the new form does is it rejuvenates my ability to get into the flow state. And that, of course, is a deep awakening of the being mode. So this isn't a complete answer, Mark, but I forewarned you it wouldn't be. I think we have to understand people's pedagogical progress as a toggling between the telic and the paratelic mode. And that's, of course, that's appropriate, right? It was never the case that it's all about the being mode or the having mode, but not confusing them together. And so the two concerns is, we have to steer between the Scylla and Charybdis of, getting locked into the telic mode or locked into the paratelic mode. And also we have to avoid, modal confusion, using the wrong mode at the wrong time. We have to fit the mode to where we are in the stage of the pedagogical program. Sorry, Mark, that's not a complete answer, but I'm trying to give you a helpful answer.
Oh no, John, that actually filled in a bunch of things for me. I made like a paragraph of notes, and we actually think we have an idea about how all of that works. And I made a bunch of notes on integration. So no, that's actually huge. It was the perfect bridging that I think we needed for the work we've been looking into. And thank you for that video on the philosophical fellowship, because boy, that was a lot different than what Manuel and I were thinking about. And that actually bridged what you just said now, bridged us into all of the conclusions we had from seeing that video and helping to sort of understand these practices better. And hopefully that'll help with the schematization of the ecology and all
Good.
that work. So yeah,
Yes.
thank you very much. That was literally like a perfect answer from my perspective, despite the fact that it seemed incomplete from yours. So thank you.
Oh, well, you're welcome. I'm trying to arrange, because Ran Lahav reached out to me. I'm trying to arrange a conversation with him. And actually, he's invited me. My schedule hasn't lined up with him to actually sit in on a couple of his philosophical contemplative companionships. So perhaps we'll be able to bring in a third perspective that could be helpful. So I'm looking forward to that. I don't know when that's going to happen because we haven't been able to sync up yet. But I was very he. By the way, he was he was very appreciative. He thought it was really cool. So that's also encouraging to get that feedback from him, and I look forward to talking to him about it.
Yeah, that'll be really exciting. Struan, you have a question for John.
Hey, Struan.
Hey, John. Yeah, I'll just make this brief. So, what would you say is the best way to present a cultural cognitive grammar?
Oh.
Yeah. Kaboom.
I don't know. I mean, I take that question very seriously. You often ask questions that I'm taking very seriously. You know that.
Yeah.
So
Well, this is. I mean, I'm really trying to build a bridge of communication here, so this is
yeah,
not an
no.
idle question for me.
I mean, okay. One thing I think I would say is, I mean, part of it. I'm stumbling because I'm not going to answer this well. I think, but I'm going to try my best.
That's fine.
Part of it is to do what I did, not taking 50 hours, because then perhaps that's a bad example. But what I did in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is I presented a historical analysis of the emergence and transformation of the cultural cognitive grammar, and I had that converge with a scientific analysis that presented its structural functional processing, and that's how I was able to try and explicate it from the history, and then explain it from the science, and show how those two fit together. And so that was my method for trying to best explain cultural cognitive grammar.
Okay, yeah, that's actually pretty useful. I think I can riff off that and give a very brief imitation, because that book that you recommended, Damascus's Problems and Solutions Regarding Containing First Principles. I didn't get to read the book, but the blurb on Amazon told me a hell of a lot, because it said that Neoplatonism as a speculative metaphysics posits the one as the exotic or extopic explanant for plurality, conceived of as immediate present hand and therefore requiring explanation. And that told me a whole lot. And so you used the word sacredness earlier, and another word that is very close to that is holiness. And holiness, wholeness, and heal are all cognates, right? And so I think that there has been, what we've lost is the sense of the whole. But if you look at, because you speak about the destabilization of the notion of realness within modern cultural cognitive grammar because of Descartes, right?
Because of Descartes,
Right. So I would say that there's a much deeper and much older equivocation with respect to the problem of the one and the many here, because You can speak of the parts in terms of one, and you can speak of the whole in terms of one at the same time. And it's not
Yeah.
clear whether you meaning part or whole. And I think that science actually depends very deeply upon that equivocation when it talks about unification and universals. And I think that that is ultimately a problem. And what we need to do is to split the concept so that we don't make that equivocatory mistake. And what I would suggest is that we shouldn't speak about the one and the many. We should speak about the none and the ones, which is to say that the part should be expressed in terms of one, and the whole should be expressed in terms of zero or no thingness.
Yeah, and I mean that's well, sorry, but that's pretty much I think what Damascus is arguing for. Not to steal from any of your thunder, because he's at great pains to say that the one is neither the summative one of totality, nor is it a homogeneous one behind things, and his term is actually the ineffable, which and he doesn't just mean non-speakable. He means very much the no thingness. And then what he tries to establish is the non-logical, and even this sounds like a contradiction, the non-logical identity between the no thingness and the particular versions of oneness that are in the determination of everything. And Pearl talks about this a lot in his book on pseudo-Dionysius, Theophany, which is much cheaper, by the way. You might want to take a look at that. And I think that the process by which things are determinate in their particularity is non-dual, right, with the no thingness. And of course, this is one of the central claims of Nishitani as well, that the no thingness is non-logically identical, which in the way in which everything interpenetrates and determines and limits everything else. So I think that if I've understood you correctly, and I might have misunderstood you, that's a deep point of convergence between Neoplatonism and the Zen tradition. And D.T. Suzuki argues for that, exactly that deep convergence. So yeah, I, and of course I remember in my undergrad when I was doing ancient philosophy, that was the problem, the one and the many. And of course, it's Plato's problem and it's Aristotle's problem. You're right. You're right in that I mean I talk about it a lot, but I don't talk about it focally as a central problem. That's a very good point. I mean, there's a sense in which all the work I'm doing on Neoplatonism is an attempt to try and get a cognitive cultural grammar for addressing the problem of the one and the many as a response to the Cartesian destabilization. But I hadn't made that a focal topic. I want to thank you for bringing that to my attention. I want to thank you for that. I'd like
Well,
that little thing I just went through when I did a review. It was basically me sort of realizing that I have been, because I was explicitly taught this, so it was in my education. I've been trying to address that problem, but I haven't. It's odd. I haven't been directly focally aware that I was trying to address it as a way of trying to give us an alternative cultural cognitive grammar, alternative to the Cartesian grammar. I think that's really good. I think that's really good. You've been saying this to me in some of the emails, and I haven't been
yes.
been getting it. So I'm sorry. That's a mistake on my part.
I'm perfectly happy to keep badgering until the penny finally drops, because I think it is important. I would say that basically, I mean, you said that I was making Mozart moves with respect to your work. All that
Yeah.
I've been doing, like I would say that the dichotomy between the part and the whole is the basic scaffolding of language itself. So all I've been trying to do is to repeat what you've said to me back to you, but with making that one move to get rid of the equivocation, and then seeing what can still be said.
Yeah.
And so it is very frustrating to me, because I think that like what you're presenting can be improved so much, just with a couple of small shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's basically what I would like to be able to discuss with you.
I see.
Gentlemen, can I say 7 words?
That's fine by me.
Yeah.
Be the one that is no other. And what is this I? Or what is I? And be ambient. It is either eternal or it isn't. I love you guys.
I think you went over your 7 words there. So we've got about.
Yeah. Well.
I do think. I mean, if I understand the reference, um, um, yeah, I do think. I mean, this attempt to try and work this, and this is where I think Strawn is bang on. I mean, I think it is a perennial issue, um, and I think, like I said, in Sufism, you're going to find it coming through the Neoplatonic elements. Um, I mean, you've kind of course, at the forefront of the Kyoto school, because they're trying to deal with Heidegger, and Heidegger is trying to get his version of the one and the many, which is the relationship between being and beings. And they also get it, of course,
You have to decide what
from.
to think. Just decide what to think about.
Well, yeah, I agree, but I don't. Well, it depends what you mean by that verb "think," because part of what the quote is talking about is not just what you're thinking, but
With the other gentleman. Focus
pardon
on
me.
oneness. Focus on oneness.
Well,
do webinars.
So
Yes.
I just like to jump in here because we only have about 10, 15 minutes left, and there's still 3 questions left. So Karima, maybe can you bring this up again next week, and we can see if we can squeeze in the last few questions, since you already had a question today.
Well, I'm fine with moving on. I mean, I'm happy to talk about what it means to focus on oneness, because I think that's actually a very important question. But let's come back to that perhaps next time. I'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, let your life be what you love. What does that mean?
And I think I said next week, but I meant next month. So sorry, it's just a once a month. It's a once a month Q&A. So Velosk, so Karima, we can start with you next time. But there's still 3 people who have queued up questions, and we don't have that much time left. So I'd like to give them a chance to get in. So Veloskin, you have a question.
Hi, John. So I've been thinking about what you've said about reciprocal narrowing and opening.
Right.
So I agree with what you've said about how narrowing leads to addiction. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And obviously that's bad. And the way out is reciprocal opening.
Right.
However, it seems that so far you've presented reciprocal opening as wholly positive, and that it should always be pursued and narrowing always avoided. But the thing is, it occurs to me that as reciprocal narrowing taken too far leads to addiction, reciprocal opening actually leads to combinatorial explosion.
Oh, yeah. And yeah, I should have made that clear. I mean, the argument that you're making is indirectly there, in that, I talk about the continuum from wonder to awe to horror. And if you pursue the reciprocal opening too much, you will get into the combinatorial explosion in a way that can't be accommodated by you, because awe is the experience of combinatorial explosion that is at least being accommodated. But if you push awe, and we know this, if you push awe just a little too much and the combinatorial explosion overwhelms people, you get horror. And then, of course, that is a bad thing. And horrifying people is not a good thing. Now, it's interesting how the concept of the numinous has is sort of strung between the poles of home and horror. and the idea being that you're kind of getting this meta-optimal grip between getting too tight of a home, which is what addiction is, and too opening of an exposure, which is horror. So that's correct. So the reciprocal opening, right? It's because our culture is so tilted towards addictive modes. I tend to speak too often about the reciprocal opening in purely positive terms, and that is a mistake. But I think you could make an argument from within my own work, as I've just indicated, saying that reciprocal opening pursued in some unconstrained fashion could turn from being virtuous to vicious precisely by exposing people to horror in a traumatizing and deleterious manner. Yeah, totally. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, thanks. That makes total sense. And I never considered that horror was like that. So thanks.
All right, so Altamira has a question that they'd like me to read. I found your last conversation with Jordan Hall on reverence and rationality wonderful, and he put some ideas forward, which I believe worth some attention. Namely, becoming myopic nowadays when approaching ontology from a computational, algorithmic point of view. What is your take on these ideas? Do you think they can be even harmful, as Jordan suggested? And in brackets, they put modeling cognitive architectures as optimization algorithms, being as a simulation, etc.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Jordan and I were converging on that. I think. I mean, it was genuine dialogos happening. He and I are going to be talking again this Wednesday. I miss him. We haven't because he's been traveling. I haven't been able to talk to him for a bit. Yeah, I mean, I think that's consonant with it's consonant with, at least I think it's strongly implied, maybe even entailed by 4E cognitive science, which is to say that we shouldn't understand cognition just in computational terms. We should understand it, procedural, perspectival, participatory, etc. And then also the idea of deep continuity. There's deep continuity between the principles governing cognition and those governing life, and deep continuity between the principles governing life and the principles governing self-organizing, dynamical, physical processes, etc. Which means what we're discovering about the principles at work in cognition, and this sounds like Aristotle or Plotinus, should inform us about how we are framing and orienting towards ontological questions. And I think seeing all of ontology through a purely propositional, computational, algorithmic frame is incorrect. It's truncating us, and it's correspondingly truncating reality, and it's not capable of dealing with, as Jordan was trying to argue, the possibility that our ontology, as Whitehead would argue, has genuine novelty in it, which is exactly, I mean, if you look at our cognition, the types of problems for which we need consciousness and insight are problems that have high degrees of complexity and novelty to them, and those we seem to process them in a non-computational manner. We seem to represent them in a different way than sort of a Newtonian framework, etc. So I agree with that, and I think that's convergent with Heidegger. Heidegger's question concerning technology is this sustained critique that the algorithmic computational approach that is embodied, maybe because that I don't want to use that word. I want to reserve that for CogSci. That is instantiated in our technology becomes the primary cultural cognitive frame by which we look at our ontology. So we see everything, as Heidegger says, as a standing reserve, as something that is always ready to be used in a technological fashion. And not only does this cause the forgetfulness of being, but as Heidegger sort of foreshadowed in the question concerning technology, it's going to lead to that forgetfulness is going to lead to profound devastation in our own self interpretation. That's the existential aspects, and to the way we treat the world, which is the environmental ecological disaster that we find ourselves in. So I agree very deeply with Jordan for all of those reasons. I hope that's helpful.
And I think your answer here touches upon our last question by Solid, which is also on Heidegger. Solid wants to know how much you yourself and the line of cognitive science that you're a part of have been influenced by Heidegger, and if they have been proving or disproving some of his ideas, like being in the world and our relationship to the present at hand and the like.
So the 4E cognitive science has been deeply influenced by Heidegger. So many people in cognitive science, in 4E cognitive science, refer to themselves as neo-Heideggerians because, of course, there's not just Heideggerians. They're bringing in aspects of dynamical systems theories, aspects from Merleau-Ponty, etc. But, for example, direct influence on me. Herbert Dreyfus, deep disciple of Heidegger, writes one of the best commentaries on being in time called Being There, in which he basically makes the argument that Heidegger is trying to point us to what, and Dreyfus uses this term repeatedly, to what I call relevance realization. Dreyfus wrote the book, What Computers Can't Do, which was considered by most people the first presentation of the frame problem, which is basically the problem of relevance realization, which I've tried to argue is the central problem facing cognitive science right now. So I think the influence of Heidegger is unquestionable, and I think the idea that Dreyfus's interpretation, and I tried to present this in the series when I talked about Heidegger, and other people, many other people, that like Gallagher and others. Clark is deeply influenced. All of this, in some ways, gives evidence for. Well, I want to be careful, that Heidegger was in an important way and in a profound way that I've tried to explicate in the series is that he was trying to wake us up to relevance and caring, because relevance realization is always an act of caring. I think to the degree to which 4E cognitive science is successful is it's providing evidence for those central Heideggerian claims. Now and then the distributed cognition is picking up on Heidegger's ideas of Mitsein. Um, uh, there's lots there. There's lots. I mean, of course, there's lots in Heidegger that has also been criticized and rejected. That's part of being neo-Heideggerian. But I think the influence is very clear, and to the degree to which 4E cognitive science is bearing good fruit, I think it is providing evidence that Heidegger deserves the status he has. That line coming out of Heidegger, also through Charles Taylor, who's had a huge influence on me, also through Tillich, who's had a huge influence on me, is clear. But I'm also very critical of Heidegger because, Heidegger fell into some pretty deep personal errors, and to say, well, that has nothing to do with his philosophy, I think that's bullshit. You can't be the kind of philosopher, the existential kind of philosopher Heidegger is, and disconnect his identity projects and his actions in the world from his philosophy. That's just inauthentic, to use a Heideggerian term, a way of evaluating him. And so the fact that Tillich resisted the Nazis and Heidegger joined the Nazis means there's elements in Heidegger's thought that are, I think, worthy of criticism, and that I think need to be subject to analysis. I think it's also problematic, and I think this was part of why he got led the way he did. One of my deepest criticisms of Heidegger, and this is why I so much appreciate the efforts of my good friend Guy Sandstock, is Heidegger doesn't give you any idea about how to turn all of this into a set of practices. And that's absolutely telling to me. And I brought this up with Guy, and Guy's whole invention and development of circling or similar work done by Thomas and Elizabeth at Evolve in Europe, at Emerge, or is it Evolve? I can't remember. Oh, I'm sorry, Thomas and Elizabeth. I'm getting the name wrong. Anyway, their work is amazing. They also are doing all this work about trying to turn Heidegger into something practicable. Because if you make the claim that there are certain important truths that are only available, aletheia, disclosable through transformation, you bloody well better give people ways of undergoing that transformation. Or all you're doing is creating a mystique around yourself, and you're liable to start a cult of personality. And so, well, I'm deeply indebted to Heidegger, and he's deeply influential on me and on the cognitive science that is deeply influential on me. I also have some pretty deep criticisms of Heidegger. So there you go.
Well,
I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that's great. One thing I love about what these Q&As are turning into are almost these continuing conversations, almost like when people play those games of chess where they move one move a day. But I love this dynamic that's evolving here with some of these conversations. So thank you again so much. I know you're not feeling great today, and that didn't stop you from giving as insightful answers as you always do. And so I really appreciate you being here today.
Well, thank you. I mean, my capacity for giving insightful answers is directly proportional to the quality and the involvement of the questions that I've been given. So thank you to everybody here, because you guys often educe from me insights, and you provoke insights from me that I wouldn't otherwise come to on my own. So thank you very much.
And thank you, thank you everyone for being here. We're starting a new book club this Saturday, right before your Saturday Sangha. So at 9 o'clock Eastern time, where we'll be going through the Wisdom of Hypatia, doing I think a chapter a week. So I hope everyone joins us.
Excellent.
And
I'm glad to hear that. Glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think that'll be great. And we continue a reminder for everyone: we meditate every day at 9:30. Many of us do yoga beforehand, and we've got lots of activities. So please check out our calendar, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you again for everyone for being here, and we'll see you all again next month.
Take care, everyone. Thank you very much.
You too.
Thank you, John. Feel better.
Thanks.
Thank
John.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, guys.